As I said, I do want to conclude this message series that I've started a couple of weeks, maybe a month ago, talking about the radical statements of Jesus. And we're ending on one of the statements Jesus made about his kingdom and about greatness, what it looks like to be great. And he talks about it in terms of service. And so we're going to just want to kind of lead into some of the teens are going to share, and then we'll have a slideshow just to give you some pictures about some of the things that we were able to do this past couple of weeks of work in our community. So Jesus is talking to his disciples about the kingdom. All these statements, all these sermons I've done are all about what it looks like to live in this kingdom that Jesus was setting up. And of course, as we read through those, as we looked at what Jesus said, this kingdom looks a lot different than the kingdom people are used to. And it looks a lot different than what the culture or what society says is important. When Jesus says to deny yourself and take up your cross and follow me. That was our theme verse for our work week. That was the message that I began with when we did this series. That is very countercultural, to give of yourself, to lay yourself down, your wants and desires, and to follow Jesus and what he desires. And Jesus has some difficult things to say sometimes and makes it seemingly difficult to follow him. And we were talking about these crowds that were following Jesus when he was doing miracles, when he was feeding thousands and thousands of people. And then he would make these statements about what it looks like to follow him. And slowly the crowds would dwindle down. So we see Jesus here again with his disciples who just aren't getting it. And they're thinking about Jesus' kingdom the way that the world thinks about kingdoms and power. And we'll see Jesus address that issue. And he talks and he uses the word called, a word that we use, being great. What does it mean to be great? Somebody who is great. And I think there's a couple of ways in which our culture, our society looks at those things. I want to see if you guys know any of these people. I have two different slides. One I showed at first service to see if any of them would get, and the second I showed there to see if they would know who those people were. So we'll see if you guys know any of these people. Greatness. When the culture, when our society, when we think about people that are great, who are usually put up as a poster for greatness? Well, greatness could be determined by your wealth. Who's this guy? Who said that? Oh, good job, Amy. Warren Buffett. This guy has more money than he knows what to do with. Instead of using tissues when he sneezes, he uses dollar bills and stuff. I don't know if that's true, but he's got a lot of money. And so in our world, oftentimes, greatness is related to or defined by your wealth. He's got a lot of pull, he's got a lot of power, he's got a lot of influence. People are always coming to him to donate to this and donate to that. He has lots of influence, and it's all surrounded by his wealth. I don't know a lot about Warren Buffett. I don't know what kind of guy he is. But wealth is one of those things that from the beginning of time have always been propped up as, here, this person is considered to be great. Look at all they have. How about this? Gary, who's this? Mickey Mantle. Did any of you guys know that? Who knew this was Mickey Mantle? Okay, good. I did it for Gary, but I figured some other people would know it. Number 7, that's right. George's name for his child, George Costanza, wanted to name his child 7 after Mickey Mantle. That's not part of the message. You can just forget about that. But this is somebody that's considered great, maybe the greatest that ever played, some people say. I don't know that Mickey Mantle's character was necessarily that great, but when we're talking about greatness, does that come into play? I've watched commentators not that long ago when they were inducting people into the Hall of Fame, and this was a question that they were debating. Does being inducted into the Hall of Fame, is it all just about numbers, Or does some of it have to do with the person's character, what kind of person they were? Did they give back to the community? What did they do? Did they get in trouble with anything? And the debate is now surrounded around performance-enhancing drugs. Does so-and-so deserve to be in the Hall of Fame because they used performance-enhancing drugs to get the numbers that they got? And it's this huge debate over whether or not somebody should get in the Hall of Fame. Some people say greatness is determined by the numbers. If they had the numbers there, they deserve to be in the Hall of Fame. We're not trying to see whether this person was good or not. Character doesn't matter in this sphere. It's a debate, and you can maybe have your own conclusions about that kind of stuff if you're into sports. But the world says greatness is defined by one of these things. He was considered great not because of the kind of person he was, but because of the way that he played the game. Greatness could be considered by power. If you have a lot of power, of course, in the United States of America, that's the President of the United States, has lots of power. Is greatness determined by your achievement to get to that level, the highest level of government you can achieve as the president? Is power connected into that level of greatness? So here are some more people. You should all know him, right? Who's that? Magic Johnson? Oh, LeBron James. Okay. One of the greatest to play basketball, they say. His ability to play this game has earned him millions of dollars, and greatness is surrounded by that. How about this guy? Yeah, everybody knows him. Tons of money. I mean, he was like 20-something and he was a millionaire or something like that. Is greatness considered wealth? Who are they? Okay, so here's another one. The culture society says they've achieved the highest levels they can in the music industry, and certainly in terms of wealth and influence and fame and popularity, they have made it. They are there. Is greatness determined by that? And power. And how about that? Is greatness determined by how many likes you get on your post, on your picture, on your video? Greatness today is somewhat determined by how many people viewed your video on YouTube. People that you didn't even know their name are now in the spotlight because their videos went viral and now people are following them. Is greatness determined by that? Nobody likes any pictures on your Facebook page. Does that affect you? Is that emotionally, are you depressed? And there's studies out there that show that it does. It actually depresses people because they put so much stock into this stuff. And that's no different than the disciples and their confusion about God's kingdom, about what greatness looked like. And that is exactly what Jesus is addressing here. Greatness, we'll see, is not determined by any of these things. It's actually quite different, radically different, you might say, in Jesus' statement that he makes. So in chapter 20 of Matthew is kind of sharing the story about Jesus, his teachings, and the things that he did. In Matthew chapter 20, verse 20 through 28, we see the disciples getting confused about greatness, about what it means to be great, about this kingdom that Jesus is setting up. Remember, the promised one, the Messiah, was going to come and set up his kingdom, and he was going to rule. And the disciples think, they're not sure, but they think Jesus is that guy. And so now if Jesus is coming up to set this kingdom up, they want to be a part of it. They want to get in on it. And so Jesus is with his disciples. He just got done in the previous verses. He just got done telling them again as he's leading up to the crucifixion, sharing with them what's going to happen, that he's going to be delivered to the chief priests and that he is going to be crucified and he's going to be killed. And so I don't know how much time elapsed. It doesn't really say. Scholars aren't positive in terms of how much time elapsed between that conversation that Jesus had and the next one that follows. And this is the conversation Jesus has with two of the disciples and then with the whole group. It says, "Then the mother of Zebedee's sons came to Jesus with her sons." So James and John are Zebedee's sons. And they, with their mom, go to Jesus, and they're kneeling down, and they asked him for a favor. And Jesus says, "What is it that you want?" She said, "Grant that one of these two sons of mine may sit at your right and the other at your left in your kingdom." "You don't know what you are asking," Jesus said to them. "Can you drink the cup I am going to drink?" "We can," they answered. Jesus said to them, "You will indeed drink from my cup, but to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared by my Father." When the 10 heard about this, they were indignant with the two brothers. And Jesus called all of them together and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." So the disciples come, and they think like everybody else. Jesus is setting up a kingdom. We got to get into places of power. We got to get in on what is happening with Jesus. And you hear a little bit later when Jesus calls them all together, the other 10 guys were mad at James and John. And they were mad because they beat them to the punch on trying to get at the places of prominence, the places of power. Jesus is setting up his kingdom, and the disciples think it's just like every other kingdom we've ever seen. They were living in one, the Roman Empire. They understood what that looked like. They understood what kingdoms were all about, and it was all about who had the most power. And so if Jesus is setting up his kingdom, and we just saw the guy feed thousands of people, make blind people see, calm storms, we want to be a part of that kingdom. And we want to be in those places of power and prominence. And that's basically what they were doing. Jesus is setting up this upside-down kingdom, except the disciples don't realize it yet. They're asking for something that everybody would have known what it was, to sit at the right hand or the left hand. That was the places of power and prominence, prestige, places of popularity and fame. If you went to a banquet or any kind of dinner, you wanted to sit at the right or the left of the host, because that was the place of power, the place of prominence. And so when they're asking for the right or left, they're asking for the two highest spots you can get. That's what you've heard the saying, "You're my right-hand man," right? You've heard that? That this person's your right-hand man. That means they're the go-to person. They're like second in command. If something happens to Jesus, James and John are right there to scoop up the power that's there. They're ready to take control. They're looking for this place of power and this place of prominence because they think greatness is connected to that somehow. If you've ever had somebody that knew they had authority and that they had power over you, sometimes we call that a power trip because they get drunk with power. You've heard the saying, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. There's this thing about power that just feeds the darker side of humanity, and unfortunately the disciples are leaning that way, and Jesus has to turn that around. So he asks them this question. When they say, "We want these places of power in your kingdom," he says, "Are you able to drink the cup that I'm going to drink?" Jesus is using language from the Old Testament about basically death, and specifically, in Jesus' case, the cross. So are you able to do what I'm about to do? I'm the one in charge of this kingdom, and here's what I'm about to do. I just told you what I'm about to do when Jesus says he's going to have to die. He just explained that to him. And he asks them, "Can you drink this cup?" He's saying, and the disciples would have heard, that this cup means possible death. And Jesus basically says to them, "You will drink this cup, but you don't know what you're asking for." So he says, "You don't know what you're asking for," Jesus said to them. "Can you drink the cup I am going to drink?" And they answered, "We can." And Jesus says to them, "You will indeed drink from my cup, but to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places are given by the Father." So Jesus says, this is what's going to happen. You don't realize what you're asking for. You think this kingdom is all about the right and the left hand, the places of power and prominence and prestige and fame and popularity, everything you want. You think the right and the left are all about that. And Jesus says, you don't know what you're asking for. Because in this kingdom, what's going to happen is you're going to suffer. That's basically what he's telling them. He's saying, you don't know what you're asking for. You will drink from this cup. Jesus is basically predicting what's going to happen to them. James is believed to be, by church tradition, the first disciple to be martyred, to die for his faith. He will, indeed. He doesn't realize it at this time in his life, but Jesus does. He will be a part of this kingdom, and he will be considered great, but not for why he thinks he will. It's not because of where he's sitting. It's because of how he served the kingdom. And John is believed to have been exiled later in his life for the sake of the kingdom. So Jesus says, you don't know what you're asking for. He calls the whole group together. The 10 are angry because they wanted those 2 spots, not because they got it. They understood what Jesus meant about the kingdom. So Jesus calls them all together and explains to them what the kingdom is all about. And he says, Jesus says to them, you know how the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. He's using an example of something very familiar to them about the Gentiles. You could substitute that word pagans. You know how the pagan rulers operate, right? Because that's exactly what you're thinking this kingdom's all about. You just want to operate the way that they do. You know how they are. That the rulers in Jesus' day were dictatorial tyrants. If you had the power, you were a tyrant. You did whatever you want. We see stories like that. If you read any kind of history, you see that happening all the time. Because power does that to people. And Jesus says that's not what this kingdom is all about. You see how they operate. In fact, they think themselves to be gods. You know, the Roman emperors and the Egyptian pharaohs and throughout history, these human rulers believed themselves to be gods, and you were supposed to worship them. And Jesus said, you see how they operate, you see how they act. That is the exact opposite of what I'm about to tell you. Because Jesus says, here's your example. And then he says in verse 26, not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. That word Jesus uses, ransom, the language behind that is the same word that is used for the purchase price of a slave. That's what that word would be used for. Jesus says, you know how they operate. It doesn't work that way in this kingdom. In fact, if you want to be considered great in this kingdom, you've got to serve. If you want to be first, you've got to be like a slave. Because I, Jesus, did not come to serve, to be served, but to serve. And I came to give my life as a purchase price for you. That's what he's saying. That word for in some translations, or as a in the NIV translation that I have, it says, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus, that language there is taking on the idea of in exchange for, as a substitution for. Jesus is saying, I exchanged my life for yours. You were that slave, and you are free now because I gave my life for you. Jesus' idea of this kingdom is about service. And the reason he can ask us to serve is because he was willing to serve, not just serve us, but to the extent that he gave his life in place of our lives. So we were that slave. Jesus purchased us with his own life. The purchase price for a slave was 30 pieces of silver. That was the same thing they paid Judas to betray Jesus. Jesus said, I've purchased you not with money, but with my own life. See, I'm not like these other kingdoms. I don't operate that way, and my kingdom doesn't operate that way either. Greatness is not determined by your power, by your job title, by your wealth, by your influence or popularity. Greatness is determined by how you serve and how you live. I mean, he's basically summing up these radical statements he's making. The last 6 messages that you heard about the radical statements of Jesus is all about this, that Jesus is calling us to do this. Why? Because he has purchased us for a price. That price was his own life. And now he has called us to serve. So he's saying to the disciples, no, it's not about sitting at the right or the left. It's about serving in this kingdom. It's about serving others. It's about a life of service. Paul says it in Philippians that Jesus came and he humbled himself to the point of a slave. Not only to just the point of a slave, but he humbled himself to the point of the most humiliating, embarrassing form of death known to man at that time. He hung on a cross. And he did that to purchase us. And now he has called us to serve him. This kingdom doesn't look like the kingdoms of the world. It is the complete opposite. And Jesus explains that to the disciples, and he makes that radical statement. This is the last of these radical statements that we're looking at in this sermon series, that in order to become great, you need to be a servant. In order to be first, you need to be as a slave. He's done something that was unheard of in the ancient Near Eastern world. You never heard someone talk like that. Nobody ever compared a slave to a master. The Old Testament talks about slaves and how you're supposed to treat them. And slavery was a part of that world. It was a part of our world for a very long time. It still exists in different parts of the world. But a slave was never looked at as an equal. They were inferior. They weren't on the same level. And here Jesus is changing them. The slave is actually above the master. Nobody, that was unheard of. I don't even know if they had the ability to comprehend what Jesus was saying there. That's how radical it was for Jesus to say what he said. Humility was not looked at as a virtue in the ancient Near Eastern world. It was looked at as a sign of weakness. You didn't praise people who were humble. Nowadays, I mean, at least in the Christian worldview, we do that. Because you see what people are like that are not humble. I played soccer with one of them, and he was very prideful, and he was good, and he knew he was good, and he liked everybody else to know that he was good. And he would try and be a one-man team, and I just wanted to hit him. But I didn't, because Jesus said we're not supposed to do that either. So I didn't, but it was hard to be around him. Humbleness was not one of the things he valued. And nobody did in the ancient Near Eastern world. It was all about power. And honestly, it looks that way today a lot of times. When I see people and athletes and people in government and people in places of power, it doesn't seem like humbleness is a quality they care about. And if you are somebody, I've had a conversation with people about, if you remember Terrell Owens. You remember him? He was maybe the least humble guy on the entire planet. It was just hard to watch him. And I remember having a conversation with somebody about, he was a good receiver. But I said I couldn't watch him, and I couldn't deal with it. And he said, what's the big deal? He's good. He's winning. I'm like, but it's more than that. I don't have any sons that play football, but I wouldn't want my kid to watch him and say, that's what you do? That's what it looks like to be great? That you act like that? So humbleness is still, in the disciples' day, in our day, it's not a trait that is necessarily connected to being great. And yet that's exactly what Jesus said, that he humbled himself and put himself in our place. Jesus defines greatness completely different than the world. He switches the two around. Slave is on the top, master is on the bottom. Jesus has called us to serve. Why? Because he did. That's where you find greatness. That's where Jesus says, why as the church do we do what we do? Why did I ask these kids up here and adults who helped to take time out of their summer to serve? Some of them took vacation. They had paying jobs and they took vacation to be there. Some of them had sports activities after they worked all day. Then they went to a sporting activity. Some of them had work. They worked all day in the afternoon, in the morning here, and then they went to their job in the evening. Why would I ask them to do that? The reason I do that is the same reason that I say that I need to do that. The same reason that I say we as a church need to do that. The same reason I say my family needs to do that is because of what Jesus did, what Jesus called us to do. Jesus' own mission was not one of self-service or people serving him. It was self-giving. Jesus had all the right to be served. He was actually God in flesh. All these pagan rulers, they pretended. The irony was that the one person that came to this earth that was God set all that aside and served others. And not only did he serve, but he gave his life a ransom for many. Why should we give? Why should we serve? Why should we ask people to give time and energy? Why should we ask people to give financially to the church? Why do we do all of this? Why, as the church, do we ask people to do these things? And the answer, I think you know the answer. The answer is simple. It's right here what Jesus said. The reason Jesus could tell the disciples that this kingdom works different, and if you want to be great in it, this is how you live. And I can tell you that because I'm willing to do it myself. And not only that, I'm willing to put my place in yours. This was for you, but I bought you. I purchased you. You're free. I put my place in that. I put myself in that place. I gave my life. Not only did Jesus give, not only did he serve, just read the Gospels, read the biographies about Jesus, the first 4 books of the Bible, and see how Jesus served. Not only did he serve, but he actually gave his very life. So why do we serve? Why are we called to do that? Why are we called to give? Because Jesus himself did it. And to be a part of this kingdom, to be considered great in this kingdom, I think the greater you serve, the more you serve, the greater you actually are. If you want to become great in this world, it's not because you post a YouTube video that gets 1 million views. It's not because you get hundreds of thousands of likes. It's not because you have lots of money. It's not because you've reached the pinnacle of job titles. It's not because of any of that. It's because Jesus has called us to serve, and it's because you are serving him and serving others. We tried to do that this past 2 weeks ago. We stayed here at the church. We moved in. We slept at the church. We ate at the church. We didn't bathe at the church. There's no showers here. I didn't hose everybody off after a long day. We went to different people's homes, but we lived here. We gave the idea that we went on a mission trip. In 2015, when I came in 2013, one of the things that I did when I was a youth and when I was leading youth ministry as a volunteer at my previous church was we always did mission trips. And so when I came, I knew that's one thing I wanted to do. I wanted to be a part of our DNA, this idea of service, that it just becomes natural to us. It's not something we even think about. We just do it because it's who we are. It's our DNA. And so in 2015, we did that. We stayed here and we worked locally. In 2016, you saw that. Some of you were a part of that. We went to Kentucky to Big Creek Missions, and we served in Kentucky. And this past year, just 2 weeks ago, we served again here in our community. So I have a slideshow I want to show you, but before I do that, I've asked a couple of the teens if they would just say a few words about this past week or 2 weeks ago, about what they enjoyed, what they learned about it. And I'm going to ask them to come up here and do that. Megan McBreen can't be here. They went away for the weekend, but she had written a note and to me just to say what she enjoyed. One of the places we went was Schuylkill Women in Crisis, and we helped at their facilities. And she really enjoyed that. Megan was one of the girls, or one of the people, that came here Monday through Friday. She came and she worked with us, and then at 5 o'clock, she went to her job and worked from 5 p.m. to 10 p.m. at her job. And but she said she really enjoyed it. She can't wait to do it again. But she was willing to do that. She was willing to deny herself and serve. So I want to ask if the other teens that I've asked to share, a couple of them sitting here, if you would come up and just share about your experience. Go ahead, start it off, Liv.
All right, during our mission week, we went over to the island and we dug up trees, the grass around them, and then we planted mulch around them. I have to say this was my favorite part because I like doing bigger projects and then looking back at them and being able to say that, like, I did this and our church did this and we did it for God.
My favorite part was going to Schuylkill Women in Crisis and cleaning for them, and also when we did the scavenger hunt with the youth group. And what I've learned is it's easy to have fun doing something that's not so fun.
Thank you. Yeah, good job, good job. See, that's the trick, is making it seem fun, even though it's not that fun. Most people don't raise their hand and say, hey, let's go weeding. Luke, I asked you to say something.
Good morning, everybody. I'm just going to start off by saying there was only about 4 guys. It was me, Pastor Ted, Johnny, and Connor. Connor's not here today, but Johnny's here. Dom showed up for a day. But throughout the whole entire trip, we made the work of 4 guys look like 8. We went to town. I was just so surprised by the strength of Connor and the motivation of Johnny. I've never seen such strength and motivation ever working with anybody with community service. We were working with this one kid the first day with Schuylkill Women in Crisis. His name was Josh, and he wasn't as motivated as we were to work. You know, he was still working, but he just wasn't as motivated. He's always trying to get a break, always trying to find a way to stop working, always wondering the time. And he asked Johnny, he goes, Johnny, come on, what time is it? Johnny goes, work o'clock. So, you know, we worked our butts off every single day, and there wasn't a lot of guys, but we just demolished whatever was in our path. First day, we cleaned out a whole entire lot of brush in this one parking lot. We weeded, we clipped all the hedges. Second day, was that the island day? The island day, we mulched, we dug all these ditches out, we cleaned the paths. And the third day, we weeded the islands, but us guys over here, we dug up the ground up front, and we took out these 4 massive stumps. That took us about a half hour apiece, almost. It was wicked. They had about 46 roots each, but we got it done, and no doubt through the Holy Spirit. But that's all I have to say about that.
Thank you, Luke. The guy that was helping on Monday just didn't get the Pastor Ted pep talk. That's why he wasn't as motivated, probably. One of the comments that was made that Luke was sharing about, each place that we went, and I'm talking about being humble, so I'll say it instead of you guys, but every single person that we helped, the people that I would line up to work with and talk to and stuff, they were so impressed with how fast these kids did the job. It was like, oh, we asked them to go and work there, and they're actually doing it. They couldn't believe that. We were running out of work. I was concerned about that because each day was like they were trying to find some more stuff for us to do because they weren't prepared for how well these guys were going to do. They got a task, and they did it. And they didn't complain about it. At least to me, they didn't complain about it. And they worked extremely hard and impressed every person they worked for. And, you know, that to me is it's just, I mean, we're weeding. We're digging holes. It's not that big of a deal. But I think the one guy, especially on Monday, was just so appreciative because so much of the news and so much of what you hear today is kind of bad stuff. Kids getting into trouble, this generation not doing this generation not doing that. And it gets discouraging at times. And so he was just so moved by the fact that these kids, and I said some of them took off work to do this and just come and help out, and it was just moving brush and simple things, but he was just so impressed by the fact that these kids would do that. And I think that's a good message for our community. I mean, they pay people to weed that parkway. You guys didn't hear that. You weren't going to get paid. But we wanted to help our community. We wanted Schuylkill Haven to say, hey, Grace Church cares about our community. How can we help you? And they appreciate it. Every single person I talked to, that was just something that they just said over and over again, was how impressed they were with the work that these kids would do, and that they worked hard, and when you asked them to do something, they did it, and like Luke said, they did it pretty fast. We were running out of work, so they did a great job. Julie, will you share? You have anything to say? You don't know what to say? Okay, then you don't have to say anything. Don't worry about it. Anybody else? I asked a few of you. Anybody else have something? Jenna? Lydia? Girls? Ella? Emma? I know you guys want to say something. No? Okay. That would really impress Mom if you stood up here and said something. So you got to hear a little bit about what they did. And I just want to say, too, that doing this kind of thing, we had to plan out all the meals. I needed people to chaperone during the workday. I needed people to sleep here at night. I needed to use people's homes to get these kids showered and things like that. And so if you got a T-shirt, then you were part of helping in some way, shape, or form. And this day or this week wouldn't have been able to happen without people's help, without people volunteering, people willing to serve. I mean, I'm sure those of you who slept on an air mattress in Cheryl's in the secretary's office would rather be sleeping at home and in your own bed, but they did it. And waking up and getting breakfast ready and doing all that kind of stuff. It's something small, but it's important because it gives us a taste of what Jesus is saying. This is what the kingdom looks like. And if we can instill this in people when they're young, when they go out into the world, then it just becomes natural. You just do it because this is what you're supposed to do. I don't know if I shared this story in here or not. I know I shared it somewhere, but I can never remember where I share what. But my friend worked at a huge company, a giant corporation. He was just a number among many. And one of the things that he did when new people came in, he would try and help them. He would kind of show them the ropes and show them what to do, show them how to do things. And sometimes, and he worked hard. I mean, he worked more than he should have. It was unhealthy how much he was working, but he was getting upset by the fact that he would do all this and also do his own work, and nobody would recognize him for it. None of his bosses, nobody ever said, well, we're so appreciative of you actually going out of your way to help these new people so that they actually work well within this company. But he always did it. Even though he didn't get credit for it, he didn't get any pay raises for it, he always did it, and he was just struggling with it. And he was just wondering why, and he was asking himself this question, and I was talking to him on the phone, and I said, you do that because that's what we're supposed to do. We don't serve hoping that somebody sees us to applaud us. We serve because that's what we're called to do, and you're doing it because that's how you grew up. You know that this is how we're supposed to be. This is how we're supposed to live. Even if your boss doesn't see it, even if people say something to you about it, you do it because it's the right thing to do. And he said, you know what, that's right. That's why I'm doing it, because he's at a new place of employment that nobody is doing that for him. And he's realizing how much that was an important part of helping other people get connected into this company that he was working at. We serve because this is just who we are. That when I say we want to make this a part of our DNA, that's what I'm talking about. So that when you're long gone, when these kids are graduated, they're off to college, they're out in the working world or wherever, when my girls are not 7 and 3 anymore, it just becomes natural for them to serve. And they look for ways to do it. Jesus says that is what greatness looks like. I could put a bunch of pictures up here that you wouldn't know any of them, but I consider them great. You know people in your life that the world has no clue who they are, but they're considered great in your life because of who they are and how they have served you. And so this past week, the why we do, and I'll do this every year that I'm here. Every year that I'm at Grace Church, every summer we're going to try and do something. Because it's what we are supposed to do. It's what Jesus has called us to do. And in serving others, they're like, and I had the conversation with the guy on Monday. Well, why are you guys doing this? And so I got to share with him why I'm doing this as a young guy doing ministry, why these kids are doing this, and I had an opportunity to talk to him about why we're doing what we're doing. And Jesus has called us to live that way. This is what the kingdom looks like. This is summing up everything that Jesus has said in these radical statements. A life in Jesus' kingdom is a life of service. And the reality is, even if the world doesn't congratulate you, even if you don't get 1,000 likes, Jesus says you're going to be first in this kingdom of mine. And as he's already said, this kingdom is the one that matters.